Back in the studio again. We are going to stay in the kind of the political lane, but pretty excited for this one. We have a former UCP star candidate that had the mob come after her. Her story is well known to a lot, but she's in here with us today. She also moved on after these events, and she found herself running her own school here in the Calgary Classical Academy. We have the owner and foundress, Caylan Ford, with us. Welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Of course, anytime. Taking time out of the busy schedule.
That's right. And as just by way of correction, it's not one school. We have 3 campuses now in Calgary and Edmonton. Just started our 3rd year.
Yeah, that's incredible. When did you start the school?
So we're a public charter school, and we can get into what that is. But basically, Alberta is the only province in Canada that has charter schools. They're public schools, but we are not under the thumb of the big metro school boards.
Right.
So we have a degree of autonomy that other public schools don't have, but we are tuition free. We're accountable in all the same ways that regular public schools are. But we have an autonomous board of directors, and we have a very distinctive philosophical and pedagogical approach to instruction. Mm-hmm. So we say it's a traditional or a classical liberal arts education, and we applied for a charter back in 2021. It was granted in January 22. We got our first school building in May, and we opened in August to 300 kids. The next year we tripled in size, added 2 new campuses, and we're up to about, this year we're about 1,300 students now.
Incredible.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty fast growth, I would think. Were you surprised by that? Or?
Yeah, it's been pretty intense.
Just trying to keep your head above water.
Until you start a school, you have no idea of how many different things go into it. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think we've all had to learn a lot more about hazardous material mediation than we thought we would. Renovating old military barracks, turning it into classrooms. Yeah, but it's been a really fun adventure.
Oh, that's excellent. And was that anywhere on your radar before? We're going to get into all the events that led you here, but was that on your radar before you even ran, or maybe during that time? Or
yeah, so I'll just sort of back up a little bit. By way of background, I think starting around the time I was even 14, 15, I became very seized with the problem of understanding political and philosophical evil. Mm-hmm. And especially as it took form in 20th century totalitarian regimes. And I was sort of seized with this question of, how does this happen? How do normal, good people end up supporting and participating in, the destruction of their societies, their heritage, their fellow man? And how do we inoculate ourselves against that, both at the personal level and at a societal level? Mm-hmm. And I think sometime around 2010, I started kind of noticing more and more that these things that are kind of signs of a proto-totalitarian state, actually it's all around us. And this isn't an original insight. I mean, no. the Soviet dissidents knew it decades ago.
Sure.
Remember Solzhenitsyn's Harvard Address or Václav Havel. They were warning about this even during the Cold War, that the West actually has all the ingredients for a kind of totalitarian system, but it takes a different shape. And so I started noticing this with increasing unease. And to me, the question was, all right, well, how do we stop this, or at least sort of slow it
down,
or try to create some pockets that are sort of immune to it, where you can sort of preserve the light of truth and learning, even when society is sort of thrown into disorder. And the obvious answer to me is that's in the realm of education. And,
sure.
So politics is sort of there's the cliche that politics is downstream of culture. It's not entirely true, right? There's more of a reciprocal relationship there, and your political circumstances sometimes do impact the kind of culture you have, and vice versa. Mm-hmm. So being in government, especially in a sort of capacity to influence education policy, I thought this is the most important thing I could do.
Sure.
And that was the impetus to run for office. So it's kind of, there's been a consistent narrative, or sort of in terms of how things have progressed and what's been driving me. But after things went sideways with my run for political office, It was a matter of like, how can I try to do in microcosm as a sort of proof of concept from the ground up rather than from the top down, what I think might help stem the tide of these things.
Well, it seems like you're on the right path. I think, like you said, the school is growing, and somehow you ended up there. But I think that suits you to a T. Because I mean, speaking of your past, you're well studied. You're highly intellectual. I think if I see the masses, when you look around and see any clips of you in interviews or talking, you're an extreme intellectual for sure. So, I think just to give some of your past here, you were, you got your bachelor's degree, Chinese history at the University of Calgary. You obtained your master's degree in international affairs from George Washington University. You were a senior policy advisor for Canada's Foreign Ministry for about 10 years. And then you also went on to have to obtain your master's in between your two children in international human rights law at Oxford. So that well-educated, and then you find yourself running as a candidate in Calgary-Mountain View. What led you to that decision?
Well, it came with a lot of prevarication. I think like many people, I find aspects of partisan politics sort of unsavory. And so what I actually ended up doing was consulting a lot of, there are some parallels in history, I think, to the kind of moment that we're in. And one parallel is Greece in the aftermath of the Peloponnesian Wars. This is the war between Sparta and Athens. And Thucydides described the sort of moral inversion that had happened, right, in his histories, that sort of, earnestness, basically sort of human-heartedness, generosity, these were sort of laughed down, and you get this sort of factionalism. Socrates and Plato obviously went through this in their own time too, of finding that the symbols of the moral order of Athenian society had been inverted, and they were both confronted with the question of what can a man do about this?
Right. Yeah.
And Plato has a lot to say about this question, especially in the Republic. You'll find quite a number of discussions of like, what kind of philosopher or someone who loves truth and wisdom can they enter politics, and under what circumstances? And you get a few different answers, but one of his answers is basically, when societies reach this state of disorder, if a true lover of philosophy were to try to enter the political realm, it would be like they were a man who's been cast among wild beasts, and they would be torn apart, right? They wouldn't be able to do anything for themselves, for their friends, for the state. They cannot contribute to the common weal of their society under those circumstances. So he says, the philosopher then will be like a man who's taken shelter under a wall in a dust storm, right? You just have to kind of wait it out. Try to guard your inner nature, make sure you don't participate in the evil of society. But then he talks about the obligation to go back down into the cave, right? And the opening lines of the Republic is, I went down. So this idea that there is a duty to go down, even though you're going to be torn apart down there.
Right. Yeah.
And interestingly, like contemporaries of Plato and Socrates in the East were grappling with the same dynamics. So in China, this is, the Zhou dynasty is fracturing. You have a sort of, so civilization again feels like it's collapsing. And Confucius and Zhuangzi was a Taoist. They too were writing at the same time about, we're teaching at the same time about what do you do about this?
Yeah.
And Zhuangzi is like Taoist, so they're sort of hermetic by nature. And they come to a same, like, when the world has lost the Tao, it's not going to recognize people of virtue. Your virtues won't be seen. You'll be torn apart. So you just have to sort of retreat in silence, wait for a more, hospitable set of circumstances, and cultivate your inner virtues. And Confucius, again, he kind of recognizes that you're in the same position, that any effort is probably doomed to fail. But Socrates is like, but you still have to do it. You got to try. Yes, you'll fail.
You got to go.
You got to go. This is your duty. This is what sort of the principles of reciprocity commands of you. You are a child of this society. It brought you up. You have to in turn serve it and try to do your best. So So this is kind of like, these are some of the sources I went to, and as I was like grappling with this question of whether it's appropriate to try to affect any kind of change in politics. Is that itself, a hubristic thing to do, to think I could make a positive difference?
Don't know until you try.
You don't know until you try. And so I finally thought, you know what, to the extent that we have any gifts at all in this life, intellectual or cognitive or whatever else, they're not really ours. They're not, it's not really attributable to our own talents. They're given to us on loan almost so that we can try to serve others and serve our societies. And so there's no praise to be had in sort of concealing your talents and keeping them to yourself or using them for your own like enrichment or something.
Yep.
You have to try to use them in service of others. So I decided to run for office. I'd moved back to Calgary to raise my kids here because I'm from Calgary originally. And
was that your same, you ran in Mountain View, but is that where you grew up?
I lived in Mountain View during university. During undergrad. So so it's a Mountain View, for reference, it's a very urban constituency just north of downtown Calgary across the Bow River. It's a lot of people who I think actually have small c conservative sensibilities, but don't know it. Don't
realize it.
Exactly. So I thought this is sort of the perfect place for me because I like persuading people that actually, if you like your small little gardens, this is a very conservative instinct.
Well, because that would have been considered a swing, kind of a high swing area. And so I think as we dive into it, the opposition would have been pretty nervous about you being this up and coming rising star, as they were labeling you at the time.
So Mountain View's, it was the only seat in Alberta provincially that was held by a Liberal for many years. Yeah. And he retired, so it was sort of up for grabs. And I was running against the leader of the Liberal Party and the NDP's Attorney General.
Right, yeah. Two big dogs, two heavy hitters, and you're brand new to politics.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. So I guess, and on the lead up to the election, you're gaining steam and you're getting, obviously, the approval of Jason Kenney and everybody's tapping you as hopefully the next after you got the nod. Let's take it back to where it intertwines to when you met, because we have to speak of Karim Jivraj. I don't know how to say his name, but because he's a big player he's the biggest player in coming after you. Yeah. So when did you meet him, and then what transpired after that?
So really kind of, this is, in retrospect, there's so many things about this story that I still just shake my head at.
It's bonkers.
The very first time I ever decided that I would dip my toe in to see what local political processes are like. I was living in Toronto for a couple of years working in documentary film, and so I was invited by a friend to go to a PC party, progressive conservative Chinese New Year fundraiser. Yeah. And just to sort of start meeting some people who are involved in local politics and seeing what it's about, how nomination processes run, et cetera. And at this event, I met this guy who, at first glance seemed extremely charismatic, intelligence. He talked about how he had studied at the Sorbonne and Sciences Po, which is top universities in France, and at Cornell, and he'd run for office before and wanted to run again. And, he was quite sort of forward. Wanted to stay in touch, and added me on Facebook, and started sending me articles that he thought would be of interest. And so we struck up a friendship where we're chatting a lot over Facebook Messenger, so their private messaging app.
Way more common back then too, the Facebook Messenger.
Right, yeah.
I'm sure it's probably gone by the wayside a little bit now. But
I think so. And would see each other at political events from time to time. Yeah. And eventually, he kind of got a bad reputation in Ontario politics. Mm-hmm. He was the kind of person who played what would be characterized as fairly dirty games, right?
Dark politics stuff.
Yeah, like pseudonymous Twitter accounts that would slander people and sort of fabricate scandals to advance the candidates that he preferred.
And this is all unbeknownst to you, though, at the time.
Yeah, I mean, I started, at a certain point, I kind of started realizing that he was into this stuff, and I thought, Now it's the real hook. And again, like I just shake my head thinking back to how easily
what do you do?
Flattered I was and manipulated by that susceptibility to flattery. But I think it was like the second time we ever saw each other in person was on the margins of a little fundraiser. And he said, you know, we wanted to be prime minister. He's like, I want you to run my next campaign. And I was like, look, I don't need a job. Like, no thanks.
I'm good.
And I don't want to be paid. I don't want anyone to own me. And he said, all right, but you can be my conscience.
Right.
And, you know, this, again, the ability to read me and to read what would flatter me was uncanny. And so I started thinking, as I was seeing this sort of stuff he was involved in, I was like, well, but maybe I could counsel him to be better. Because there's a person with a lot of innate talent, like really great potential.
People spoke pretty highly of him back then.
I think at least some people did.
Some,
right? But, you know, he was clearly a very intelligent, charismatic, well-spoken, articulate person. And so I thought, you know, I could sort of help him. I
could just tame this dog a little bit.
Tame this, you know, like remonstrate with him when he does unethical things. So I started becoming aware of this, but I sort of justified a continuing friendship. One, because it's like he was fun to talk to, frankly. And I thought I would have this like salutary influence on his character. I was very wrong. He eventually kind of got given the message that he was no longer welcome in Ontario conservative circles and to get out of town.
Yep.
And I was planning on moving back to Calgary, and I always talk up Calgary, so I love it. And so he's like, I'm going to go to Calgary. I'm going to seek a seat there.
He said that?
Yeah.
After you did?
Well, he knew I was planning on
he already knew.
Back. Okay. And he was always kind of trying to figure out where else to go, right?
Yeah.
Go to Yukon, go to like wherever he can find a seat, right? And eventually he settled on Calgary, and I helped him get settled here, found him a job at a law firm and place to live. And
did you feel like that was odd that he decided? Like, did you think he was kind of following you out, or?
No, I don't think I thought about it.
No, you didn't think about it.
Yeah. I knew that he was ambitious. He wanted to run. He was looking for a seat that would be safe. Yep. You know, he no longer felt welcome in Ontario, so it kind of made sense to me. And I moved back to Calgary soon thereafter. I was planning on having a second child, and Toronto's not a place for children. So
no. I grew up around there. So,
did you?
Yeah. Very familiar.
I'm not a fan.
No, we grew up not fans of. I've said it in here before. I grew up in Cambridge, so a lot of farm, small community. Yeah. So we grew up kind of not liking Toronto, like going in and then getting the hell out.
Exactly. Yeah.
So
I live near the intersection of the DVP and the 401.
Oh. Yeah.
So
yeah.
Not in one of those high-rise condo towers, but, you know, the nice little cul-de-sacs that used to be a middle-class, sort of working-class neighborhood. And now every lot sells for $2 million.
Oh, yeah. That's the wealthy area.
And it's just inhuman. Like, you can't walk anywhere. It's
crazy.
Just undifferentiated sprawl.
Yep.
Anyway.
Yep.
So moved back to Calgary. Again, I started sort of exploring what the political scene looked like here. And pretty quickly, I decided I would run in Calgary-Mountain View. And at that point, things started getting really weird with Jivraj.
Yeah.
He was also angling for a seat in Calgary. And long story short, he started doing things like spreading rumors that I had made false Me Too accusations against other people in political circles, which, you know, is basically just intended to sort of tar a woman's reputation, right? Because if men think that you're given to making spurious accusations of that nature, they're not going to want to be alone in a room with you, right? It's
no, for sure,
right? So so I started there, and he bought my internet domain name, and then he took over the board of my local constituency association to try to manipulate. So he would have control over my nomination process.
And what were you saying to other people at this time? Were you telling people like this guy is a problem, or he's going to be a problem?
I mean, generally, I try not to engage in this stuff. Right?
Sure.
Like it's, I was busy running a campaign. I didn't want to give it energy.
Yeah.
I think I took the perspective, you know, as things continued escalating, and I would sometimes be forced to kind of confide with my core campaign team about what's going on here.
Yeah, of course.
But you know, I always treated it as, like, when you're trying to accomplish something, I think you can always expect a commensurate degree of difficulty.
Well, and it is politics, so it does get a little filthy.
Right? So yeah, there's going to be obstacles. Try to stay above the fray, you know, and use it as an opportunity to like temper your character, to cultivate like equanimity, and just try to be like, I just tried to be broad-minded and philosophic about it, basically. And then he filed a false police report saying I'd assaulted him in a cafe.
Tapped him on the shoulder.
And then he sent, you know, pseudonymous emails to all of the electors, all the UCP members in my constituency just before the vote, telling them not to vote for me. He would make up quotations and attribute them to me. The
things that you had said.
Or he would pretend that I'd said
things. That you had said,
Buy Google ads on searches of my name and put these fake quotations there.
And he said you took up like an illegal residency.
So he created a story that I'd committed fraud. Residency fraud or something. Planted this story in there's an outlet called Press Progress.
Well, I was going to come up anyway.
Which is functionally, Press Progress seemed to operate to me as basically the oppo research, the opposition research mill for the NDP.
For the NDP,
And they would publish stories about negative stories about UCP candidates, and then try to sort of push them into the mainstream media through that mechanism. So they carried his story that he basically sort of fabricated this story that I'd committed residency fraud, and then would buy Google ads making up quotes from me directing to this article, right? And it was just sort of one thing after another.
I didn't, you know, it's funny. I'll just stop you real quick. I know we're giggling, and this is, you know, you're 5 years in.
Yeah. But, this is like 7 years ago now. Right?
You have 7 years, yeah. So
it started about 7 years ago.
You kind of have to laugh, but just I was going to say it out of the gate, but just for people like you do have your doc on caylanford.com. You have this documentary. It's about an hour and a half. You can watch this entire thing. You can check it on there on Vimeo for $9.50, and it's phenomenal. And it covers all of this stuff. But so anyway, so he's buying these Google ads, and continue.
Yeah. So eventually, things just sort of keep escalating, and at the urging of my kind of close campaign team, eventually I filed a police report just to make sure that all this stuff's on record, because I thought this had probably risen to the level of potentially criminal harassment. And the election was going to be called eventually the writs dropped on March 19, and that kicks off a 28-day writ period before the election.
Yeah.
And the night before the writs drop, Press Progress emails me saying, you know, we've obtained screenshots or something of a private conversation that you had with an anonymous source. And it was the kind of, this was not a genuine media inquiry. If you've ever received one of these kinds of media inquiries, right?
Mine would have been about hockey back in the day, so I'd be excited.
Right, fair enough.
Different,
These are not questions.
No, this is like, I got you.
These are like, here's a series of accusations. Do you want to answer them?
Yeah.
Where the accusations are of the nature that you don't even want to dignify them because they're so absurd, right?
Sure.
But basically, I get this email essentially saying, you're a white supremacist who supports white supremacist terrorism, and we're going to run this story, and you have 3 hours to respond.
Unreal.
And they wouldn't tell me, like, they wouldn't actually show me these screenshots they'd obtained.
No.
So, I was in no position to comment had I actually said these things in a private conversation with an anonymous source years ago. So
I'm sure you had an idea.
Well, I had a sort of vague recollection. So I know Jivraj and I had talked about issues related to his, like, the issue that really consumed him was about civic nationalism.
Yeah.
He had studied in France. He had really strong views of how immigration, sort of the failure to integrate immigrants, was destroying French culture. He was really concerned about preventing this in North America. He was sort of obsessed with this.
He felt they needed to fully assimilate, to drop their cultural and religious and just be absorbed into.
Yeah. So his view was, so as opposed to sort of ethnic nationalism, which is the more traditional view of nation states were basically ethnic groups forming political entities, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And civic nationalism is more the idea of creedal nations that are bound together not by ethnicity, but by commitment to some sort of universalizable or transcendent principles, right?
Yeah.
And institutions and forms and culture. So he was a big proponent of civic nationalism, and he thought, look, Europe can integrate people from other parts of the world provided they assimilate completely and adopt European culture, right?
Yeah.
So leave behind all of their religion, their customs, their sort of cultural affinities. And this is something that he wanted to write about and sort of campaign on. So we'd have conversations about this. I was in Europe doing a degree in the summers, especially. A lot of what I was studying was related to refugee and asylum law. I had studied terrorism in my previous master's degree. So there's kind of the intersection of a lot of these issues we would talk about. And when I remember after the, if you remember the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville back in 2017.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And I remember we had a conversation after that. And my perspective in that conversation was about, well, we're not doing a very good job at de-radicalizing, especially young white men. Like we're basically doing the opposite of what we should be doing when you leave them with a feeling of sort of dispossession. You demonize them as men, and you demonize them as white, right?
Yeah, that's
and this
the
is like
full
this
attack,
is a really bad thing to do if you care about figuring out a way to live comfortably and sort of harmoniously in a pluralistic society.
Yeah.
So I remember having conversations like that, and that was what was now being spun as me expressing sympathy for terrorism.
Right. Yeah.
And it was just, they took basically 3 sentences, removed a bunch of the surrounding context, removed certain words.
Yeah.
And then we're going to present that and sort of repackage it in this new contextual setting right after, by the way, we're now days after the Christchurch Mosque massacre, right? So
so this is really on everybody's mind, and it's big.
Exactly, yeah. And you have a lot of communities that understandably are feeling very vulnerable, feeling like they're under siege. And so I think what they were doing was trying to sort of cynically take advantage of that moment to frame this as Star UCP candidate basically as sympathetic to white nationalist terrorism.
White nationalist, yeah. And so what he had done is, he leaked these private conversations. As you said, they're super lengthy, in-depth conversations on your thoughts versus his thoughts. And then Caylan does list everything is on her website, and obviously we're paraphrasing a lot of things, but you go on to say, in other parts of this conversation with Jivraj, I'd explained at great length why race essentialism is both empirically and morally false. I decried the identity politics of both the left and the right, and argued that it is completely incompatible with the values of a liberal democracy. And I express my belief that all people are imbued with inviolable dignity and a spiritual equality. My accusers included none of this in the reporting, presumably because it conflicted with the narrative they sought to advance.
Yep.
So it was pretty clear that came out that they just took it and ran with it, and it was just a pile-on effect.
Oh, yeah. So
immediate.
So Press Progress, basically, I get this email, and they're like, you have 3 hours to comment. So I just try to put yourself in this position. Someone tells you,
I've tried.
Someone tells you, like, years ago, you had a conversation. I'm not going to tell you who you were talking to, but I knew, of course. And I'm not going to show you transcripts of that conversation, right? So, like, you're going to have to take my word that you said what I'm claiming you said.
All right.
And we're going to publish a story that is going to destroy your career and your reputation and your social life in 3 hours. Do you want to say anything?
I can't imagine. And obviously then you guys are kind of war rooming, meeting. What the hell do we do?
Yeah, and look, obviously, and I knew Press Progress at that point.
Yeah, you know what the hell's
they'd
going
already
on.
published 3 articles claiming that I'd committed fraud.
They're already coming at you, yeah.
And I had told them, actually, just to give you a sense of how serious these guys are as journalists. One of them on Twitter, one of the Press Progress reporters, was tweeting this thread of this sort of conspiracy theory of my residency fraud.
Right.
And I responded. I was like, actually, I moved back to Calgary at this time.
I'm from here.
And you can pull the title on my house if you're that interested, if you want to see, and
dig.
Go for it. Their conspiracy theory was the Calgary Herald had published an article about me, and they're like, oh, this was a planted puff piece that the UCP planted.
Oh, okay. Spinmeisters.
Calgary Herald published this because the documentary film that I made won the award for Best Canadian Feature at the Calgary International Film Festival.
Yeah, wow.
So, totally organic. And I was like, but anyway, just putting it out here to correct the record. And his response on Twitter was, that's not what I heard on Up Dog.
What? What's Up Dog?
Exactly.
What's up, dog?
He was trying to get me to respond, "What's up, dog?" And then he would have said, "I don't know, dog. What's up with you?"
What?
This is how serious they are as journalists,
shit.
right? So,
Okay.
like,
Wow.
So this is their response to me giving them, data to say your stories are false. So I knew when they reached out to me on this night that they were completely uninterested in what was true.
No, they had in their minds, they got the trump card. They got
The stories, when they're saying we're going to publish this article in 3 hours, it means the article's already been uploaded to their content management system, and all they have to do is hit publish.
Just trying to get a little soundbite from you or something.
Or they're trying to cover themselves against a potential defamation lawsuit by being able to say, we sought her for comment. Right. Fortunately for me, their understanding of defamation law was lacking. So,
good. Yeah, we'll get into some of that too, hopefully. Yeah. But yeah.
So you're war rooming, trying to figure out what can you do. And one of the questions that the party asked me when I let them know what was going on was, well, do you have a record of these conversations?
And you didn't.
I did not.
Well, go ahead, take a sip of your tea there. You probably want to have a little drink. But you again, you kind of explained in here. Yeah, you didn't have the record of these conversations because going back a year prior, you guys basically are having a falling out, and he asked you to delete the records. You deleted them and blocked him and said you're out of my life, kind of thing. And so you didn't have the records, and this is just on Facebook Messenger. So already you're 29 days before the election. They drop this hammer on you. You're dead in the water.
Oh, totally.
You're dead in the water.
There's nothing to do. And if this had come at an earlier time, right?
Yeah.
If you're 3 months out from an election, there's time then to get your perspective out and to say, here's what I actually believe, to try to assuage the concerns, the understandable anguish or confusion of people who are, don't know what to make of this. But you can't do that in the throes of an election campaign where every single day, the media's, it's like the parties have their messages that they're trying to get out.
Yeah.
It would have been a big distraction from the campaign, would have affected other candidates potentially, or there was that concern. So no, that there's going to be no time to explain what was the context of a lengthy academic discussion.
Yeah. You can't. And so how long in between the time that all came out till the time that you were even able to say anything at all? You did release a statement eventually? I don't know how many days
so
it was.
I think it was after 11 p.m. that night. So it was about 4 hours after the story was published.
Yeah.
The NDP had already issued a press release basically saying,
she's done, yeah.
She's done. Why is she still on the ballot? Jason Kenney needs to do the right thing and remove her immediately,
well, and all the UCP now, they're all bigots and they're all racist.
Yeah, they're all bigots and racist, and this is proof that they're a racist, hateful party. And if you want to try to defend yourself, you have to get rid of her. That's the only thing you can do, right?
Yeah.
So I was basically kind of directed to resign.
Sure.
And I was given 10 minutes to write a statement resigning and publish that just before midnight, and that was it.
Because everybody knew there's nothing, we can't even defend you here. Especially that you don't have the proof. So it's like, sorry, you got to go.
Yeah.
That must have been horrific. Must have been horrific.
I'll be honest, that night I published the statement of resignation. My two closest members of my campaign team stayed with me at the office all night. And we sat around after, and I was like, well, I've kind of been thinking that at some point, I didn't think it would be now, but at some point, something like this is probably going to happen to me being in politics. And
this is just earlier.
This was earlier than I thought. I thought I'd at least get to choose the hill I die on, right? Like this felt that there's a special indignity to being told, I'm going to manufacture a hill and I'm going to make you die on it. And pretend that this was the...
Yeah, that's exactly what it was.
And it's this is not a hill I want to die on. So,
and there's a small part of you too thinking, I'm going to fight through this, and this is just going to be my first adversity that I'll have to overcome. In politics.
I said, I actually have this document that I've been building on the desktop of my computer that's called When the Mob Comes, and it was sort of my collection of aphorisms and quotes and dialogues and poems that I thought I will turn to this if I should ever find myself in this position of being, wrongly accused or cast out or ostracized or whatever.
Foreshadowing, almost.
And So the first thing in there is this exchange from the Credo dialogue. So Plato's dialogue, Credo, where Socrates has been sentenced to die. Do you know this? Do you know this?
I don't.
It's a beautiful short dialogue.
Okay.
And so Socrates has been sentenced to die for trying to lead a philosophical life, essentially. And his wealthy friend Crito, comes to visit him in prison and finds Socrates totally at peace, right? Even though his death is imminent.
Yep.
And Crito has arranged for his escape from Athens. He's bribed all the right people, and he's arranged a ship to take him to another shore. And Socrates basically says no. This was the.
This is where I'm supposed to be.
This is where I'm supposed to be. This was what was decided, and I basically I'd have to live with integrity, and so I will accept this fate. Mm-hmm. And then Crito says, "Well, if you won't escape for your own sake, escape for mine. Because if you don't, people are going to think that I had the means to save you, and I didn't. They'll think I valued money more than the life of my friend."
Yeah.
And Socrates says, "Well, my dear Crito, what should we care about the opinions of the many? Because good men, and they're the only ones worth considering, they'll see things as they truly are." Mm-hmm. And Crito gives the natural rejoinder. He's like, "What are you talking about? I mean, the opinions of the many can do the very greatest harm to you, as is evidenced by your own case, right? You're sitting here awaiting your death because a jury of your peers decided to sentence you to death." And Socrates is like, "Well, that would be well, because then they could also do the very greatest good. But as it happens, the opinions of the many can do neither good nor evil. It's just a matter of chance, right?"
Sure.
So this was my first. So I read this to them, and then Kipling's "If" was the next thing on that, right? And I haven't memorized it, but it's great.
No, it's another one over my head. Oh, for sure.
It's fantastic.
I'll have to look into that one too. Yeah. And I think you just had the Credo in your documentary as well. You discussed it. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's fascinating.
But "If" is the if you can keep your head about you and all of you are losing theirs, right? And you can basically, if you can sort of endure slander and yet sort of carry on and see the things that you've built sort of torn down and then and build them up again, right? So
build them up. Yeah.
This is Kipling's much more eloquent than I am. But,
I think you did pretty good.
So yeah. So that first night, I was
you were kind of okay with it almost.
I was like, it's all right. Life is we have our trials, and they're given to us for good reasons, and I maintained something of a philosophical disposition for a while. Mm-hmm. And over time, I realized I was philosophical about it because I was pretty confident that I would be vindicated.
Sure.
And it's when the vindication didn't come.
Never came.
That it got pretty dark.
Well, they continued to pile on, and CBC ran with it, and everybody, Toronto Star, every major outlet. And these are, people should know too, you are in and out ongoing defamation lawsuits against all of the said above, CBC, Toronto Star, NDP, everybody, which is part of my French. If it was me, I'd be like, yeah, fucking get them. That would be me if it happened to me. Now, I understand. You also run a school too, so but yeah, I would. I don't know what I would do. I guess everybody says that. I don't know what I'd do in that situation. You were backed right into a corner. Yeah,
and it was. And I think that the UCP's perspective was probably, look, if you resign, the story will go away. It didn't go away.
It did not. And did they kind of? Do you feel like they kind of turned their back on you too?
Oh,
didn't want to associate, right?
Yeah,
sure. Everybody just went, "I'm not dealing with this. She's a dumpster fire. I can't deal with this."
No, I was. I was basically the persona non grata. I mean, to the point that political staffers working for the UCP were told, "You're not allowed to, you can't meet with me in public. You can't follow me on social media. You can't like my posts. You have to basically pretend that I don't exist." And that's how I was treated. I mean, I'd walk down the street, I would see people that I thought were my friends, and they would avert my gaze.
Oh my God.
So I was totally treated like a ghost.
Yeah.
And
awful.
Talk about the media, it was on CBC's The National with Wendy Mesley. It was the front page of the Toronto Star 4 times. There were 16 articles in the Calgary Herald, right? Mm-hmm. It was full on, and it never totally stopped.
No, it was just abuse. It was abusive. It continued, and I saw. Well, they're in your doc too, but I remember reading it back then. From Mayor Nenshi at the time was all over it. He was just all over that. Or Rachel Notley, of course,
gleefully,
gleefully. Yeah, he was happy.
He's laughing about this person who supports terrorism, which to me just is indicative of these people were, I think, just profoundly disingenuous.
Slimy.
They didn't believe what they were saying, and they're almost laughing about how great this is.
Because they know the real narrative.
Yeah.
They can't not know.
Yeah, because if you actually believed that a potentially prominent politician or someone who is this far away from holding influence in your if you actually believed that they had the beliefs that you're attributing to them, you would not be smiling describing it, right? You would approach it with a level of like the gravity that would be due to the situation.
Exactly.
And anytime you see Notley or Nenshi talking about it on camera, like they're laughing.
They're laughing, and he even tried to. Nenshi was even trying to make fun of your intellect, like, however she wants to get all wordy about it. Racist is racist.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah. It's embarrassing. So you, but I guess, how long till you were able to retrieve, I'm pretty sure you have it in the doc too, but till you were able to retrieve the Facebook messages to kind of start putting that out there? It was like, was it 23?
Yeah, it took years to be able to actually, so I eventually launched litigation against some of the parties involved.
Okay.
So I filed for a restraining order against Jivraj.
Yeah.
Because he didn't stop after this.
Yeah, he kept it going. Yeah. What else did he do?
After my resignation, his purpose became to make sure that I would never talk about it. Right. So I could never talk about what he had done. So, he would, any time I would appear on a podcast, he would threaten the podcast producer.
Pull the advertisers. Like you, Daniel Smith, you went on that show,
but
of course, but before.
To give the level of eeriness that it got to was, I had recorded an interview with a podcast producer down in Florida. Yeah. Interview hadn't aired. Okay, so there's it's not out there. And he emails this guy using a pseudonymous account and starts trying to threaten to blackmail him.
How does he even know you're doing the podcast?
He later claimed that his lawyer was monitoring stuff.
It's crazy.
Yes,
he is crazy.
It was wild. Yeah, so I mean, this eventually came out that he actually started contacting the podcast producer's former colleagues to collect dirt on him so he could blackmail this guy to stop him publishing an interview with me. Like that level of you're not I'd been sort of slandered egregiously, and then I was not allowed to talk about it.
No, he doesn't want you defending now.
Yeah, exactly.
Because he knows it's going to come out.
Yeah.
Well, and I said to you off air before we got on, I know it's years later, but I was even, after talking to you on socials, I was concerned that it wasn't you. Maybe that's me being dumb.
You were being catfished or something.
I was like, am I just going to be waiting in the studio for you?
Oh yeah, like he offered someone $10,000 to swear a false affidavit against me. It was madness. And so it was a nightmare. And he has training as a lawyer. He's not a lawyer.
He's not a lawyer,
but he went to law school. He did some articling. So he has enough awareness of how the legal system works to make it really frustrating for someone.
Sure.
So, but it took 4 years, but eventually I got a permanent restraining order. He was found in contempt of court for having violated an interim order. Yeah. And I launched a defamation lawsuit against the NDP, Progress, Toronto Star, a lot of them, like 14 or 15.
Sir, yeah, you list the majors, but and there's some individual names in there too, like Emma McIntosh.
So as part of that, we were able to sort of to have an application for Facebook, now Meta, to produce these records. Yeah. And they were able to produce. They couldn't retrieve the records that I had deleted, but they were able to produce the records that Jivraj had.
Oh, okay, I see.
Yeah. So. And that
was
great.
Enough. Because he had everything.
He still had everything, yeah.
Wow.
Or at least anything that he hadn't sort of deleted, right? Because
when they retrieved it, did he know they were retrieving it, or would that even matter? You know what I mean? Would they have to say, "Hey, we're pulling this from you"?
Yeah,
or,
they knew that this was a big fight in court, right?
Okay.
Eventually, we were able to get the order to do that.
Man, yeah, he is off his rocker. And so, what else have you found? In the litigation process, you do make mention something about the NDP not having official standing.
So, I mean, it's been an interesting, it's the interesting journey going through civil litigation. Yeah. For one, on the restraining order, that case actually made new law. So it's thanks to that case that Alberta now has a tort of civil harassment. So previously, harassment in most provinces in Canada, harassment is only a criminal offence. It's not a civil offence. Now harassment is a civil cause of action in Alberta.
Because of
this case.
Your case.
Yeah.
Because he tried to counter. Didn't he counter with his own?
Yeah.
Just all kinds of ridiculous.
All sorts of stuff.
Just throwing spaghetti at the wall.
It was wild. Like the number of pages of like interim applications that were necessary in this case would fill binders, right? It was so much obstructionism. But yeah, now there's a tort of civil harassment in Alberta because the judge basically looked at it and was like, look, this rises to this level that it actually merits recognizing a new cause of action.
Okay.
And then in the defamation action, the tricky thing was I wanted to sue the Alberta NDP, right? They were part of this.
They were.
They pushed the press progress story into the mainstream media and made it a story that the other media kind of had to cover. Mm-hmm. And the problem is they don't exist, so you can't sue anyone.
So what does that mean? They don't exist? Like they're not.
Yeah, they're not incorporated in any way. So they're not a society. They're not a not-for-profit. So
they had trouble finding representation then too.
Well,
correct.
Well, no, they seem to have found representation just fine. It's just that they're not a legal personality, so you can't sue a non-entity.
Yeah,
you can't sue like your friend's bridge club or whatever.
You can't sue an address or
right. So it doesn't have a legal personality. So we looked into this. We saw that. We thought, well, how are they registered as a political party? Like, how are they taking donations and entering into contracts and leases and stuff? How do they have a bank account?
Sure.
So when they registered with Elections Alberta back in 1977, they registered pursuant to a trust deed with the Alberta New Democratic Party Foundation. So we said, okay, well, we can sue the trustee, the Alberta New Democratic Party Foundation. It also doesn't exist.
Oh, you're kidding.
So it's a sort of like weird shell game, right? Where you lift up the shells and there's nothing there.
Interesting.
So then we said, okay, well, their constitution says that they're a section of the federal NDP. Mm-hmm. So, and the federal NDP does have an incorporated association. So we're like, we'll sue the federal party. Right?
Sure. Yep.
They didn't like that at all. And they spent an enormous amount of legal resources, apparently, trying to get out of this, saying we have nothing to do with the Alberta NDP. We're functionally separate.
Too bad, yeah.
Not our business what they've done. For a brief time, I was losing that fight. And it's kind of in the weeds to get into the details, but eventually the Alberta NDP said, look, we'll nominate someone. We'll nominate an individual to serve as our representative. You can sue them. We'll indemnify them.
Okay, right.
And they did this before a judge, right? Because we had a meeting with a judge to be like, how do we resolve this? And they're like, look, this is what we'll do. And we're like, cool, like that's fine. I don't care as long as I have someone to sue.
Yeah.
And then the judge is like, all right, well, that's settled. Glad you have a solution. So now we're going to discontinue against the federal NDP. And you, meaning you owe them costs now because you're discontinuing. So I owed them $45,000 in costs.
You owed the NDP
the federal party $45,000. And this is a time I am unemployable.
Yeah,
right?
people won't speak to you.
People won't speak to me. My reputation's been so torched. I can't work. I'm the primary breadwinner for my family. Yeah. And I'm like paying all these legal fees. It was really stressful. I like nearly walked in front of a bus that night. I was like, I'm done. The injustice of it all was just too searing. Mm-hmm. And then the provincial party, they said that they would nominate a person to stand as and they never did.
They never did.
So we had to go back to court years later and get this finally resolved. It was finally resolved in my favor. I got my $45,000 back.
You did.
And the cost award was reversed. They now owe me costs.
Okay.
So that whole process, though, ended up with like a very funny written judgment about how absurd it is that the Alberta NDP, which was a ruling party in Alberta for 4 years, doesn't
legally
exist, right?
Yeah.
So they, basically they can wrong people, they can violate contracts, whatever, and people have no legal recourse against them.
No, I can't even. Yeah, that's hard to wrap your head around that they can be a political party like that with no incorporation.
It's pretty wild.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah.
Well, and then tied to them would have been the press progress, who recently you guys settled. I don't know.
No, not quite. So there's
not quite.
Often confusion over this. So press progress is the sort of quasi-media arm of the Broadbent Institute.
Yeah, Broadbent Institute. That's what I meant.
So Broadbent Institute, named after Ed Broadbent, the former leader of the NDP.
Yeah.
It's very incestuous between the Broadbent Institute and the party, right? Mm-hmm. Like they actually used to funnel money to the Broadbent Institute through the party, right?
Sure.
until the CRA slapped them on the wrist and told them, you're not allowed to do that.
Can't do that anymore.
And then there's another group called Progress Alberta.
Yes.
Run by Duncan Kinney.
That's the other name.
And Kinney's also a fellow with the Broadbent Institute. Again, very incestuous, all of these relationships. So Progress Alberta had gotten involved in this, right? They launched a petition against Danielle Smith when she still had a radio show.
After you went on her show,
she was the only person who would have me on for a long form conversation.
Yeah.
And they launched this petition against her, being like, "We're gonna, you've platformed a white supremacist."
And can people still find the clip, or is it actually deleted other than in your documentary?
No, because I downloaded it. And
of course, good.
YouTube is run it's under California law, where both parties in an interview have an equal and indivisible share of the copyright. So I'm like, well, I own this. Even if Chorus Entertainment caves to pressure and pulls this down, this is mine.
Yeah.
So
because Danielle clearly says at the start of the interview, like, we're just trying to give both parties an equal opportunity to just speak.
Yeah.
Like we're doing today.
Exactly.
Speak.
Yeah. So she had me on. This is like 10 days out from the story breaking. She had me on, and she's a great interviewer.
Yeah, she is. She's phenomenal.
And she didn't approach it with a presumption of guilt, right? Which is how
everybody else
would have done.
Yeah.
We just had an open-ended conversation. It was great. Yeah. And then she faced huge pressure to pull it down.
Because they went after her advertisers and everything. Luckily, I don't have any. So.
I think at this point, I think the tide's kind of turning on some.
Yeah, I think so too.
Media ignores me now, but they don't.
You're not totally blacklisted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But Progress Alberta, they launched a petition against Danielle Smith. They've now settled out for $250,000 in this case.
Okay.
So my lawyer gets paid finally.
Yeah, he gets paid finally. Well, then I even see some people grumbling, online and social. Well, why would she settle? Right? What do you say to that question? It's a tough one. But
my lawyer has to get paid.
But that's where my head went.
Yeah.
Everybody's got their own opinion on everything.
Yeah.
My head went, geez, you got to live, and you have to pay. You've had all these assuming insurmountable lawyer costs this whole time.
Yeah.
Right? Obviously, and then on your website, people can donate to help fund your litigation.
Thank you for pointing that out.
Have to say that. Please help. Caylan, continue. Yeah.
So, Progress Alberta's total share of the liability, I would say, is like sub 3%, right? They were not the ones that broke this story. They came in 10 days after the fact with this petition against Danielle Smith. The ones who probably have the greatest share of the liability, it's some of the other parties, right? It's the CBC and the Toronto Star and First Progress. So let's take that 3% figure as a share of total liability, right?
Yeah.
And $250,000 is pretty good for a 3% share of liability.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, you got to do the math on things and move on, because they're not the only, that's just the first pin in many in a bowling alley, if you want to use that phrase. There's more to fall.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what do you feel like your goal is? Is it in your mind and in everybody else's mind? Is it to win? Is it to feel vindicated? Is it what is your? It's not just about money.
Yeah.
But what do you feel like?
So the most difficult experience of this, I call it it's an experience of exile. It's a strange modern exile, because you're not physically, you're removed from the shores of your home country.
Right.
But you feel like you're an exile in the sense of no longer belonging in the world. Mm-hmm. And, people treat you it's a sort of experience of ostracism and...
like a pariah. Yeah.
Like a pariah, and a feeling of, you've been cast out by your community.
Yeah.
So I think one of the most difficult things about that experience was, I alluded earlier to the sense that any gifts that we have a duty to use them to serve. And I felt like there was no longer any avenue in which I could apply my talents and to contribute to my society.
Yeah.
Right. No one would hire me. Like I couldn't, like charities told me that they wanted nothing.
They couldn't speak to you, and I'm sure they're all like, sorry, but I can't.
Very quietly, like, none of us believe it, but, it looks bad. You're a reputational liability, even if none of us really believe it. And so we can't have anything to do with it.
It's the weirdest place to be.
Yeah. And
everybody empathizes, but still won't deal with you.
Yeah. And a great abundance of private courage on display. right?
Yeah.
But very few people had the sort of public courage to say, you know what, actually this treatment was wrong and this person isn't what everyone says, right? Mm-hmm. So cancel culture works through a mechanism of preference falsification, basically. Is like the vast majority, I'd say 90% of the people that I've actually encountered out in the world, they're like, oh, I saw through that story right away, right? Like, what a travesty. I feel so bad for you. And yet, if you look at the response on social media at the time,
no one stepped up.
The ratio's flipped. It's like
everybody piles on.
And anyone who has any doubts, they see how overwhelming the social consensus seems to be. Mm-hmm. And so they conclude, I must be in the minority and I better keep my mouth shut. Right. So it's this weird kind of preference falsification machine that happens on social media. It's analogous. I remember talking with there was a professor at Harvard who compared it. He called it like a lapidation, which refers to a stoning, a public stoning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And like using that analogy, there's also a biblical analogy that the philosopher René Girard talks about in the context of scapegoating a lot. That when Christ encounters the woman caught in adultery and she's being condemned, and the law is you'd stone her to death, and he says, let these without sin cast the first stone at her, and gradually everyone they drop the stones from their hand.
Yep.
And so Girard would talk about a mimetic cascade. If someone starts throwing the stones, it becomes easier for the people around them to throw stones too, right? The more people participate, the lower the kind of barrier to entry. It becomes easier for everyone else to throw their stones. They're imitating the crowd. And in the reversed analogy, in the biblical story, it's the first person drops their stone and turns away and walks and leaves. Mm. And then that becomes the behavior that's imitated.
Right.
One of the distorting effects of social media, though, is you can see the people throwing stones, right? And every time you see someone throwing a stone virtually, the barrier to entry is lower. You feel like you want to participate. You want to,
jump in on it.
You want to jump in. You want to even distinguish yourself by being more extreme, more hyperbolic in your rhetoric, right? Show yourself to be the vanguard of moral purity. But you can't see the people who are dropping their stones and walking away on Twitter. Because all it is
all you see is everybody.
All you see is the silence, right?
Silence. It becomes almost deafening. Yeah. The silence is so loud.
So you get
so large. I mean.
So you get the mimetic cascade effect for the stone throwing, but there's no mechanism on social media for the sort of positive mimetic cascade of the people who are like, no, I'm going to reserve judgment. I'm going to walk away.
Yeah.
So it's I think that's one of the ways that social media kind of polarizes the discourse. I don't know how we got onto this.
Well, that's what we do. We just bounce around. Yeah. I'm not trying to invoke emotion. I wanted to play because we were just talking about this right now, but I want to play this quick clip from your documentary. This was obviously at a very tough time in your life, but just right here.
Yeah, like the darkest period was probably when the hopelessness and the despair really sunk in. And I felt like this was going to last forever, and I would never extricate myself from it. And I would be useless to everyone and everything I cared about for the rest of my life. That it would just be better if I ceased to exist. Like, not by my own hand, I wouldn't do that. But, wouldn't it be better if I just didn't wake up one morning, or if I just died in some freak accident? I was like, I stared into a void and I liked what I saw. And I didn't want to exist. Ultimately, what you come back to is that if you can do good in whatever small corner of the world is yours, even if it is much smaller than you imagined. If you can be there for your children and give comfort to strangers and show kindness to your friends, then that has to be enough.
Pretty emotional stuff. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to get you emotional or myself emotional, but of course you see your beautiful children in there too, right? Like, so that's at a pretty dark time in your life.
Yeah.
So like, you would have been at the bottom of the pit there.
Oh, totally. Yeah. So I think the question that you'd asked was why, like, you know, what's the impetus for the lawsuits? What am I trying to achieve?
Yeah.
And part of it is, there's an element of wanting vindication for myself, but also for myself in the sense of so that I can get back to doing the things that I feel called to do, right? Mm-hmm. Because as it stands, I feel very handicapped. You know, I used to do a lot of like international human rights advocacy for people who were victims of torture and forced labor. And I was like, I can't do that anymore because no one will listen to me anymore.
And this is what you took in school, and this is what you cared about, and human rights and asylum and
So there's that, and then there's also the element of the people who engage in like cancel culture. They'll often say they'll say things like, "Oh, there's no such thing as cancel culture. It's just consequences, right?
Yeah, it's consequences.
You're just facing accountability."
They want you to say sorry.
Yeah. And I would never do the false, I would never do the coerced apology thing, obviously, right?
That's a lie.
It's a lie, and I'm not going to bow to a mob that wants to make me lie. Like, I'm not going to participate in a mob, and I'm not going to bow to one. These are just
here's what I literally said. You may interpret, but I'm not sorry for speaking. Yeah.
And anyway, we can get into the sort of the mechanics of forced apologies, but I was just like, look, I've got deontological principles that I don't betray. So that's it. But yeah, so they're always like, it's just about accountability, right?
Yes.
And fair enough. Well, let's hold you accountable. Not before a mob. I'm not gonna like arouse a mob to try to get you fired from your jobs. Let's go through a court of law where there's actual standards and there's actual due process, and you have there's a presumption of innocence. Actually, defamation law is a little
different.
Shifts the onus a bit. But,
it does, hey.
But, you know, you've got a process. You can defend yourself. You can know who your accusers are. You can know what the evidence is before you. And this was something I was not granted, but I will grant it to you, and we will hold you accountable. And I'm hoping that by doing this and by imposing costs on those who, you know, again, I think about some of the people involved. You think about, you know, then Mayor Nenshi and Rachel Notley and others, just sort of laughing at the destruction of another person's life. Because it was politically advantageous to them.
Gotta burn you to the core.
And I think there should be some consequences for sort of frivolously destroying lives with false accusations.
Yeah.
Because it's not just the life of that person that you've done that to. I think that it undermines the basis of social trust. It undermines the basis of social trust when you eviscerate the boundary between public and private spheres. When you say we're going to rely on networks of secret informants to tell us what you're saying in your private conversations, and we're going to publicize that to destroy you. Well, I mean, this destroys your capacity for trust. You'll always be looking over your shoulder, wondering who's listening, who's going to take you out of context, whatever, right? And yeah, when you're trying to sort of arouse enmity between factions in society, I think this is a terrible sort of social solvent in the sense of it has a disintegrating effect on the fabric of society, on your ability to look at each other with friends.
What's this?
You know, there's no redemption in this. Like, cancel culture has no capacity. There's no space for redemption because that's not what it's aimed at.
Yeah.
It's not social shame for the purpose of improving you. It's social shame for the purpose of destroying your enemies.
Destroying in the sheer joy of the mob.
Yeah.
It seems.
Yeah.
I don't know how do you have thoughts on, because I do want to talk about your academy, but do you have thoughts on how you correct that or even begin to tackle that in the social media space? Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, you know, one of the, I would often see on Twitter people saying, you know, sending mean tweets about me and calling me a Nazi and a white supremacist.
Yeah.
Saying that I should be put on a plane and sent to Russia and then shot out of the sky or whatever.
Awful.
And sometimes I would start conversations with these people, and I would do it privately, usually. If they have their DMs open, I'd send them a DM just to kind of remove that performative element of what they're doing. Right?
Yeah.
Because most people, when they say stuff like this on social media, They're not trying to start a conversation.
No.
They're trying to it's performative. They're trying to show for their social circle, evidence of their, as I said, their sort of imagined moral purity.
And they want to invoke a rise out of you and then bully you essentially, and then send it around.
Let's take away the performative aspect. I'm going to approach you as a human being and send you a DM and be like, look, I'd be interested in having a conversation about this. I'm wondering why you're saying this about me. I'm happy if you feel hurt by what you've heard about me.
Yeah.
I want to alleviate that pain by telling you what I actually believe.
Yeah. How can I help you?
Yep.
Yeah.
And what I found in this experiment, this is a coping mechanism, by the way. This when you're right, it's
you're thinking, okay, let me just talk to these people.
It's the coping mechanism is the intellectualization, right?
Okay.
It's I'm going to use the pyre is a very interesting vantage point for observing the mob mentality, and I'm going to approach this as a sociological experiment. So it's a way of trying to dissociate personally by viewing it in the third person. So I'd be like, well, this is very interesting to me, and I want to understand what's animating these people. And what I found was that almost without exception, the people doing this were incapable of engaging in a dialectic dialogue. They weren't willing. I don't think they were capable.
Yep.
The very few people who would engage, it was actually quite illuminating, and they would sometimes say things like, well, okay, I'll admit that what you're saying is true, but basically I don't want it to be true.
Well, and I think they have to admit they're wrong.
Well, it's that they. So I'd say, look, these are the kind of the empirical trend lines that I'm observing when I say that demographic replacement is a thing that is occurring in Europe. These are the trend lines. This is the point at which you'll have, the kind of traditional ethnicities of these countries will be minorities in their own countries, whatever.
Yeah.
Here's the evidence that we have historically about what is likely to happen in that process.
Mm-hmm.
These are empirical observations rooted in human nature.
Yeah.
And we can then talk about what to do about that. We can, you can, whatever. But you have to admit the basic empirical facts and trend lines and probabilities based on what's knowable. And they'd be like, okay, well, I suppose you're right, but I don't like it. And basically, so we should stop people talking about it. Because that may be how human nature is, but it's not how I want human nature to be. And so we must sort of suppress people who call attention to this.
Yeah.
And I think this is a sort of utopian view of if we just suppress the truth, we can sort of manufacture a new one, or we can allow room for a new kind of reality to take root if we just stop people from noticing true things.
Yeah.
So,
interesting.
So anyway, I found, by and large, there's been a breakdown in the idea that there is a unity of truth and goodness. There's sort of metaphysically, I think this is one area where there's been a strange sort of collapse, because I take for granted that in a conversation with someone, you and I may disagree, but if we both believe that truth is good and is something that we should be orienting ourselves towards, then there's basically there's a basis for us to then engage in dialogue.
Yes.
Right? If we're both saying, let's see together how closely we can get to this thing up here that is good, this true thing. And then we can compare our evidence, and then we can, muster moral arguments. If you don't admit truth is a good, if actually one party says truth is bad, you have no basis for dialogue with that person.
No.
Basically, they're playing by a different set of rules, and you can never see eye to eye.
No, never.
And their perspective often is not just truth isn't good. It's that truth or reality is disordered, and we need to remake it.
That's where I was thinking right there too.
Yeah.
Not grounded in reality.
Yeah, it is fundamentally, I think, it is a view that is hostile to reality. And I actually I sympathize, because there was a time in my life, in my early teens, where I think I shared that outlook. I looked around the world and I saw injustice and iniquity and suffering, and it pained my heart. And I thought, basically, that the sort of the order of being is wrong. It's disordered. It's corrupted. And somehow, through force of will, we have to wrest control over being and remake it and order it properly. And this is a painful place to be, because you've basically set yourself in opposition to reality. So you've entrenched yourself in a state of permanent dissonance, where there's something in your soul that is not just misaligned, but is hostile to to the order of being.
Yeah.
Studying the Russian Revolution helped disabuse me of these ideas.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
So anyway. So what do you do about it? Well, one, you have to try to make sure that you're not the kind of person who participates in the disorder.
Yeah.
Right? Don't participate in the mobs. Seek truth. Do it courageously. Stand up for your friends. I think it requires a reorientation toward truth as a good thing.
Yeah.
So one of the things we teach in our schools, we say is our sort of first point in our philosophy is truth exists. Mm-hmm. It is at least partly apprehendable through human reason. Not fully, we'll never achieve totally mastery of it. We should never presume to, but we can orient ourselves toward it. We have this capacity of reason, and truth is good, and it's just, and it's beautiful. And if you sort of take that as your like metaphysical starting point, I think you end up in a very different place. And then part of it is basically, I think, providing people with roots in tradition helps prevent them from being too easily manipulated.
Yeah.
So, I mean, there's a reason why when we talk about culture, there's a botanical analogy there. Culture is the same. The idea of cultivation comes from the idea of cultivating plants. And we as human beings, we're akin to plants that have our roots in the sort of the rich loam of our inherited traditions. Mm-hmm. And if a person is uprooted, or just as if a plant is uprooted, it'll be swept away by the wind or cast out to sea or whatever. So having deep roots where you're able to draw nourishment from the wisdom of the past will allow you won't be as easily moved. You won't be shaken by any force that applies itself to bend your will. Mm-hmm. And you'll be able to grow taller, and you'll bear fruit, and and the chain of connectivity between generations will continue. So we try to provide kids with a root with a sense that reality is good. We try to provide them with roots in an inherited tradition that they can continue and be part of. Mm-hmm. And we're very, we're pretty broad in that. So it's not just sort of what we would traditionally think of as the Western tradition, but you can draw on wisdom traditions from all over the world, and sort of draw nourishment from them as well. And I think it's about rectifying our moral vocabularies, because I talked a lot about people in cancel culture. They want to display their moral righteousness. I say that not to denigrate the idea that there are moral virtues. There absolutely are. It's just that people have a disordered idea of what they are. So, saying terrible things about someone on social media is not a virtue. Rushing to judgment about a stranger, attributing to them the very worst possible motives it's not a virtue. It's the opposite of charity, right? So I think setting right our moral vocabularies so that we can say, actually, we should be charitable. We should try to assume the best of people rather than rushing to assume the worst. We should be forgiving if people have erred. We should be committed to seeking the truth about them. We should be courageous in the defense of our friends and anyone who happens to have been mistreated. So it's that sort of getting the moral vocabulary right and being able to teach people, how do we actually judge right from wrong? That assumes you have to believe that there is a difference between right and wrong. So we get away from this sort of like value subjectivity. And we say, actually, no, there are better and worse ways to live. There is such thing as beauty and ugliness, as right and wrong, as just and unjust. And we want to help kids learn how to discern what those are, and give them the sort of the tools and the capacity to reason clearly about these things so that they are not unwittingly swept up in philosophical corruption. Yeah.
And it's, so easily preyed upon or swept into the mob, as you say. So your school is classicalacademy.ca if people want to research about your school. And you call it a classical education. Yep. So how would you define a classical education? It's on Caylan's website here, but how would you?
So when people walk into the school, they'll see things that look different. One, I was just guiding someone on a tour today, and he was amazed at how calm it is. So the kids are really polite. It's very orderly. When you step into a classroom, the kids will rise and greet you. They'll say good afternoon to you in the halls. Yeah.
And uniformed.
Yep. So they wear uniforms. On the walls, we don't have whatever, like the posters advertising the social issue of the day. We have enduring works of art from around the world, across mediums and across millennia. So things that that have sort of proven that they're beautiful and worth revering over time. In the classrooms, we do mandatory Latin starting in grade 5. The kids start learning some Latin roots and etymology earlier, but we start formally teaching it in grade 5.
Yeah.
They study world history in a really, the history is like what I get really excited about.
Yeah.
So they learn world history. So I have one daughter now in grade 1 who they're doing like ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Greece. The teachers brought in their busts of Herodotus and Thucydides to talk to the kids.
Excellent. That's great. Yeah.
My daughter comes home having like memorized parts of the Code of Hammurabi, and
wow,
it's very cool. So they go through like world history sequences.
Do you set the curriculum, or yourself and your board, or how is the curriculum set?
So we are obligated to satisfy the requirements of the Alberta programs of study.
Yeah.
In a lot of areas, especially in things like history, that's a fairly low bar to clear, to be honest.
Yeah.
And a lot of the outcomes are so sort of vague that they can be interpreted and achieved in innumerable ways. So basically, it's a curriculum that's pretty easily penetrable in different ways. So that's why we've done this world history thing, and then we have a Canadian history and civics track as well.
Yeah.
So we kind of decide that internally, and that comes from a lot of consultation with the board and with the faculty who are teaching it. And
that's excellent.
Yeah, and they do strings ensembles, they sing in choirs, like traditional hymns. So those are some of the things about how it looks, but it starts from, we have, I think, a very different anthropology and a different metaphysic.
Yeah.
And it goes back to what I just said. We think reality exists. We think actually there's a moral dimension to reality. So I think
let's not be hiding things.
Well, and it's just, look, if you go, a lot of schools today, if you try to talk about virtue with the teachers, it's like they're allergic to the idea of virtue because they associate it with some kind of religious moralizing, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
And they say, well, who are we to say, right? There's your truth, there's my truth, right? Always.
Yeah, everything's just big, open, and fluffy, and
It's like, look, again, this is like if you study the history of totalitarian regimes, there's nothing a totalitarian ruler likes more than a people who have no way of differentiating between truth and falsehood, between justice and injustice, because these are people who everything just becomes a matter of sheer power.
That's right.
So
it's been creeping into our society in the Western world for quite some time.
So you need standards that are transcendent, that are above any human or worldly power, that you can judge those powers against. Right. So if you have a transcendent standard of moral values, then you can judge your leader and you can say, you are not conforming to these things.
Yeah.
You've lost the mandate of heaven. You should be overthrown. If you don't have the transcendent standard, then your worldly authority is the highest authority. And what is right is whatever they say is right.
Yep.
Right? So you have to have this transcendent standard. And so we're like, you get public school teachers who are like, are you teaching virtue? So it's very religious.
Whoa, we're going back down this road, are we?
We teach them through, like the kids read Aristotle, and later we talk about Aristotle and the Golden Mean and Confucius. And
oh, wow.
So, so we have a different anthropology, a different view of what human beings are for. We don't think that the purpose of education is narrowly to make people ready for work, right?
Yeah.
Like, they should be ready to work, to contribute to their societies, whether that's, out in the workforce or in some other way, in some other vocation. But that's like a secondary benefit to us. It's, are you a well-formed human being? Are you going to be a good friend to others? Will you be a good neighbor? Will you know how to change a tire?
Yeah, respecting neighbors and discipline and
will you be able,
manners?
Will you be able to find a spouse and raise a family? And and you have a soul. And your soul also thirsts after things that are eternal. And how do we fill that part of you?
Yeah.
So I think it's a different view of what education's for. It's a different view of what human beings are for. That's not utilitarian.
Right.
And it's a different understanding of the nature of reality and our relationship to it.
And it's K to 9, K to 8, K to 9.
This year in Calgary, we're K to 9, Edmonton's K to 8, and we'll be adding one grade per year to follow those oldest kids all the way up to grade 12.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. So you're enjoying this part, hey?
Oh, this part's fun. I mean, the faculty are just, the faculty that you get to work with is just incredible, and the kids are really delightful. So there's a lot involved, but it's been very fun.
Yeah. And just lastly, so what is next in regards to these lawsuits, the many, it's just they're all, you must, are you going to court all the time? Or
I don't have to go to court as much now. There was a time when it was a lot of like interim applications, but it looks like we're going to have a court date for, I think it's shaping up to be a 5-week trial in early 2026.
26.
Yeah.
This is the big one that's kind of brought against everybody.
That's right. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, I think we hammered on a little bit of everything there. So wish you nothing but luck out there with specifically the lawsuit, but more importantly, where you're at today and the growth of yourself and the school. So I wish you nothing but success out there.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks for coming in. We'll see you next time.